Hello everyone, welcome back to Major Hi-Fi. I'm Luke. Today we're going to be talking about 64 Audio's universal IEM, the U18s. This is an extremely advanced piece of technology and I have quite a lot to say about it. So I'm excited to share my thoughts and let's get into it. So 64 Audio is known for making extremely advanced high fidelity IEMs. They have an entire section on their website just for audiophile IEMs, and this is part of that. So we've seen models like the U12T, the U18T, and now we have the U18s. So let's start out by looking at what's in the box. The U18s comes with an 8-braid silver cable. It has 8 conductors, 0.28 ohms total impedance, pure silver-plated oxygen-free copper wire, 65 strands of 44 AWG wire, and low microphonics. It's got a white sort of metallic look to it. It's also less easy to tangle than I found with cables from other models such as the U18T. All of these are pretty tangle-free, but with the thicker braids on this one, it tends to be a little bit harder to tangle too badly. We also get a bunch of different ear tips, rubber and foam. They're arranged in this cool kind of circular pattern here. It feels very space age. And then we also get the Apex modules, and these are really cool. So basically we have 3 different options for different levels of sound isolation. There's -10, -15, and -20 decibels. And these work using 64 Audio's air pressure exchange technology, which is basically vacuum sealing your ear in a way. It's taking all of the excess air out of your ear and creating a perfect seal. You just pop these out of the back of the IEM and pop in a new one. It's very Spy Gadget-esque. And I've tried all of these. They all work well. They arguably change the character of the sound somewhat too. These obviously are not going to make or break the IEM for you, but I think if you are an audiophile, you're going to really appreciate the versatility and ability to customize. We've seen this option featured on other 64 Audio IEMs like the U12T, which has 2 sets of modules, but this one you get 3 sets, so extra variety. These also have a low impedance of 8 ohms, so if you don't want to use an amp, you do not have to. So the look and feel, these have a matte black finish on the main body, and then on the back we have this silver etched pattern that has a kind of abstract geometric shape to it. I think these are objectively really cool looking IEMs. They're pretty neutral in a good way, you know, like you can't really go wrong with silver and black. It's not going to upset anybody. These are really comfortable, honestly. You're not gonna have trouble fitting them in your ears and keeping them there. They don't rub up against any parts of like, you know, your inner ear that makes it uncomfortable after a while. I had no problem wearing them for a long time, never felt like I needed to take them out. So I would say comfort, I give these a check. And looks, I think they look really cool. They have a very sleek, modern, honestly very luxurious feel to them, and that seems about on par for what you're getting. So these have 18 balanced armature drivers in them, 18 per ear. We have 8 low, 8 mid, 1 high mid, and 1 high. The high driver is where things get extra interesting because it's one of 64 Audio's signature TIA drivers, which is a tubeless driver. And that's basically meant to prevent any tube interference that might cause distortion or any impurities in the sound. So that's on the high driver, it's closest to the nozzle, and we have one of those in each ear in addition to the 17 other drivers. The U18s also features linear impedance design, which is supposed to ensure consistent sound no matter what source you're using. And we also have something called an electrical low-pass filter. This works through a circuit that targets unwanted frequencies and basically lowers overall distortion. So there's a lot going on with these. In fact, on the back of the packaging, we have kind of a diagram of all the different pieces of technology put into these. They're incredibly impressive. They run for $29.99, so these are definitely a higher end, higher priced IEM, but if you know 64 Audio, you know that they are all about the highest possible quality. And the more you learn about these IEMs, the more impressive they become just as a piece of technology. So that's before even getting to listening to them. Okay, so I've told you all of the technology that's in here, all of the different bells and whistles, and it is really cool objectively, but you're probably wondering, like, how does it actually sound? You know, the proof's in the pudding. So I've spent a lot of time listening to these, and I have quite a few thoughts. So to start out, the soundstage on these is just wild. Like, it is so wide. Of course, compared to, you're never gonna reach the same level of width you get with an over-ear open back headphone, but that's not what we're really trying to do here. But in terms of the world of IEMs, this is going to be one of the widest sounds you get. It's definitely comparable in width to other models from 64 Audio. I've namely heard most the U12T. I haven't been able to get my hands as much on the other models. There seems to be an extra degree of width and expansiveness about the U18s. It's just got this really full surround sound atmosphere, and you will be immediately impressed. No matter, regardless what you think of the rest of this IEM, when you hear the soundstage, it's impossible to not be like, oh wow, really? You know, it's just wild. The instrument separation on this, I think, is very balanced. So we do get a fair amount of separation, and you're able to sort of, you know, pick out the reverb from vocals and the room sound and whatnot. But I also like that it's not so separated that we get this kind of incoherent, disjointed sound. I'm aware this is kind of a matter of preference. Some people want an insane amount of separation. Some people find too much separation a little bit uncomfortable sounding. I think this kind of meets in the middle, where there is definitely some blend going on, but it feels like it's just enough to keep it together. And then we're getting enough separation to keep the soundstage really breathing and thriving. Obviously, stereo recordings, doubles, background vocals, anything panned is going to take full advantage of the soundstage on any listening device you use. But listening to, say, any song that has really prominent doubles on the side, or a really prominent stereo recorded horn section, or, you know, a piano that's recorded with a bunch of different mics, you know, underneath and all kinds of different angles and whatnot. Any sort of complex or layered and spread recording on these sounds just next level. Like, they really knock it out of the park with anything sitting on the sides of the spectrum. And I guess that's where the sound separation and the extra wide soundstage really come into play, because they just make it so, it's so satisfying, you know what I mean? I listened to it and I just immediately was so entranced. So the frequency response, the tuning on these, it's not overt, if that makes sense. So when I usually listen to a new IEM or a new headphone that I haven't heard before, my first impression is usually something about the frequency response, as I'm sure it is for many of you. You know, you put on a song and immediately you're like, oh wow, the mids are totally muted here, or the high is rolled off. It doesn't have to be a criticism, but you just have an immediate reaction where you can tell what is being altered about the sound. The tuning becomes immediately, you know, apparent. And these are just so subtle. It's sort of that concept of, you know, doing something really difficult so well that you make it look easy. There's obviously an absurd amount of fine tuning and accuracy going on here. But when you listen to it, you don't hear a ton of just like cuts and boosts and whatnot. You hear a very uniform, well thought out sound. And before I could really get to the, you know, analysis of what was happening, I just was so struck by how the music wasn't really being reshaped into something different. It was just being given a really beautiful platform. And that's, I think, what I look for, you know? So let me come back to earth here and not get too abstract. These have an overall very warm sound, but what's interesting about it is that it retains a lot of definition and detail. So basically, I feel like sometimes a lot of warmth from an IEM can mean that the edges are kind of smoothed out a bit, and maybe the high is rolled off somewhere, or it's really cut in certain areas. Maybe the high mids are very muted, you know, the bass is boosted, just sort of the typical ways that warmth is kind of achieved. But the method of achieving warmth here is much more nuanced and subtle. They have a lot of punch and definition to them. The punch mainly lies in the low end. I found in like the 30 to 50, maybe edging into 60, but starting to taper off a little bit towards that area. the punch definitely hits more in the lower end. Compared to, say, if you've heard the U12T, the U12T has a bit more punch in the low mids, whereas this has a bit more punch in the lows. It still punches in the low mids, but comparatively it's kind of the inverse, where I think that the U12T has less punch in the lows compared to these. The low end overall is very clean and very controlled. So it handles, all different levels of low end very well. I wanted to hear some loosening up of the low end at times, just let it run wild. And I kind of found that with this, the low end did a little bit of a bait and switch on me. I was listening to them and I put on Headlock by Imogen Heap. And if you've heard this song, it's definitely got bass and low end to it. And it can kind of go either way. I've heard it translated a bunch of different ways from different headphones and IEMs that I've listened to. And on this one, it was definitely getting this sort of rich, really nice sound in the low end, but it did feel controlled. It felt very clean. And that's something that a lot of people really like, and I do at large appreciate. And I was listening to it and I thought to myself, this sounds good. I wouldn't mind just that extra little, boost. Or not even just a boost so much, but just a little bit less handling, a little bit more hands-off approach. But then after that, the next song that came on, also by Imogen Heap, is her song 2-1 or 2-1. If you've heard this song, it does have a fairly strong bass line. And when this came on, it was like totally an eruption of low end. And it didn't feel like it was being boosted exactly. It didn't feel like it had just been like, a knob had just been turned up and made the bass way stronger. It just felt like it was translating every single bit of low end this song had to offer to me, and not leaving anything out. So it just felt very full bodied. It's not the kind of bass that's gonna rattle the inside of your head, but most people don't want that. I think maybe sometimes I lean a little bit closer to that, maybe because I'm young, I don't know, and I grew up in this sort of high tech universe, but I think it's definitely a crowd pleaser in this area, because if you like a subdued low end, maybe these would be a little bit strong there for you, but it's so clean and controlled that I think you'd have trouble feeling like, yeah, this is too much for me. Overall, I would say the low end on these is extremely powerful, but very versatile. So it can really go a bunch of different directions. It doesn't feel like it's giving the same treatment to everything I listen to. Okay, so I want to talk about the high end next. I would usually talk about the mids first, but there's a reason I want to get to those third. The highs in this are also very warm and very clean. They are not as bright as the U12Ts, for example, but they're definitely noticeably bright, but it's not in a metallic way. It's much more silky. So I like a brighter sound, but I think it's done so wrong often, where it's way too shimmery, or it's just kind of added as this layer on top that just sits there and feels very unnatural. It's just so easy to mess up. It's a very, very delicate part of the frequency spectrum, and if you don't treat it that way, it's going to show. And so for these, that's part of what I really loved, is that it's this really nice warm brightness, but as I said before, it's this interesting contrast between warmth and definition. So the highs are very detailed, but it's not like the detail is being brought out by just boosting more high end. It's being brought out by the dynamics, by the tubeless technology, by the cleanliness and realism that's offered here. I found myself listening to songs I've heard a million times and noticing details that I hadn't before. I listened to one of my favorite tracks for, an absurd amount of detail, which is Journeyman by Amon Tobin. Please check this song out if you like high quality audio. I test all my monitors, all my headphones, all my IEMs, everything I test with this track. It is like the ultimate test to pass, and especially for high end, because it is bright, but it is also just so challenging to properly translate. I was listening to it and it felt like the high end was making itself very known, but politely, if that makes sense. It wasn't so overwrought that I just felt like insulted by how much brightness I was getting. It has a very refined, tailored high end to it, and I think that's where the sound of these is really elevated. The very controlled, tight low end and this sort of smooth, fluid high end, they complement each other very well. They make sense together, but they are both very warm, and that brings me to the mids, which is I think where things get a bit more variable here. The low mids on these definitely do a good job of avoiding feeling boxy or stuffy. Like I said, they don't punch quite as hard as I found on the U12T, which I've listened to a fair amount. So the low mids don't really take a backseat to the low per se, but they definitely kind of give it space to shine. Whereas the high mids are a fair amount more present. We get a little bit of added sharpness. So we kind of have this warmth on either side that sort of joins together with this sharp middle. And that's kind of what I feel like needed to happen at this point in the tuning, because if we had warmth, just pure warmth going throughout the response, it was going to become stuffy and kind of congested. So having this slight sharpness to the high mid felt like it really brings it together and solidifies the sound, and also just once again brings home all that definition and just really locks in the coherence of the sound on these. So one track I used for the mid-range was Borderline by Joni Mitchell. It has this wonderful wide analog bass sound that comes in, and we've got this incredibly well-recorded guitar and vocals, of course, legendary vocalist. It's got a good contrast of intimacy and atmosphere. So I listened to this Joni Mitchell song along with a fair amount of her discography, and I also listened to a lot of Milton Nascimento, who is a Brazilian singer, and a lot of his songs are very minimal, just guitar, vocals. Some of them get a bit busier, but at large, it's just these two elements. And the same for Joni Mitchell, where she can do a whole band and a whole, sometimes orchestra, but a lot of the songs are kept simple. So that was kind of where I put these to the test, and are they going to be able to translate a busier mix as well as they can translate a more minimal mix and a more minimal composition? And it's not easy to make just 3 elements on a sonic level absurdly impressive. When you have a ton of stuff going on, you can spread it out and you can cut and boost things and have a million different details and really it's just a different mechanism going on. And so that's what I found these did so well, was the amount of realism, I would say hyper-realism they offer, because it really is that moment you listen to the song and you're like, oh my God, I'm in the room with the artist. It did really feel like that, and that's something you don't get to experience very often at that level. So it just translated the vocals and the guitar so organically and intimately, and it felt just extremely close to, I felt very close to the music on a figurative and sonic level. So I felt like these just did an incredible job of creating realism and creating an environment, a room for the sound to be heard in. I've noticed kind of that with the audio market, and especially the headphone market, there's a big challenge to create new technology and innovation, and that makes sense because we want to hear the best sound, we want to advance, we want to move forward. But I do find that sometimes it seems like certain companies get really caught up in the technology and they kind of lose sight of the goal. And I sometimes listen to headphones or IEMs where it feels like a bunch of awesome technology put towards creating a very complex sound. And it just starts to feel like you're hearing all the mechanizing going on, It becomes a very inflected, stylized translation of the music, and that can get kind of disconcerting at times, I find. What 64 Audio feels to be doing is using complex technology to create really seamless, beautiful sound, and that's sort of what I want to see as much as possible. Yes, these are incredibly technologically advanced, but when you listen to them, you don't think about it. It's just trying to respect your music and give you the best possible translation of these recordings, as opposed to giving you the most complex, reformatted version. And the same goes for if you're using these to perform live. It's not giving you this sort of reimagined idea of, your set. It's giving you the set as it's happening around you. And I think that that's really satisfying to listen to, when it's just sort of a lot of work is put into the organic, natural sound of something, as opposed to trying to reinvent the wheel every time, But at the same time, I do understand that some people want a very, very stylized, modulated frequency response. And these might not be for you if that's what you want. But if you are looking for just pure natural immersion, that's what these excel at. I keep using the word realism because I think it's very accurate to how these sound. So yeah, these are just super impressive. If you've liked other 64 audio IEMs, I'm not saying that you're gonna love these more than the ones you already have. Obviously, they all have pretty different sound signatures, but I think that these fit in their wheelhouse of extremely high fidelity and a lot of care put into the tuning and the construction and the different elements inside. So yeah, that is my opinions on the U18s, and I will be back soon with another review. Please tell me anything else you'd like to see, any questions you have, I'd be happy to answer. Okay, I'm signing off now, but I will see you all next time, and until then, happy listening.